First of all, thanks so much for coming. It's really nice to see everybody here. We are super excited to be hosting Ethan Marcotte tonight. It's a really special night. And first, I want to say a couple of things. Just logistically, we have bathrooms in the back of the room. There's one back. There's another one directly below it on the first floor. There's also water to the left of the refrigerator. And we have beer, wine, and soda. Thank you to Vermonster and CSS Comp for sponsoring that tonight. We're also live streaming the event tonight on YouTube. I posted a link on the Meetup channel, the Meetup site, the page. So hopefully people at home can also watch it, and I hope the audio and video quality is okay. We'll see. So first, I want to give the mic over to Kadam from CSS Comp. He has a couple of words to say. And Chris. Matt.
Okay. Any of the above, honestly. Yes. So, this is Kadam White. I'm Matt Marcotte. We are from Boku, and we are doing CSS Conf this year. And we would like to invite all of you to attend in a longer-winded way than I've just said.
CSS Conf is going to be on September 26th and 27th, a Monday and Tuesday, just over the channel in the Seaport area near the Convention and Exhibition Center. It's going to be at Laugh Boston. CSS Conf a couple years ago was being run down in Florida. Last year we partnered with them to run it in New York City, but Boston's such a great CSS town, it was high time for it to come here. And we're really excited to be doing not just that, but also a workshop day beforehand with workshops on design, command line, techniques and skills, and other related topics. So we have an awesome lineup of speakers. Last year was great. We had Leo Rue and other people there to talk last year. We're really excited to have a great lineup again this year. It's super diverse. There's a lot of topics being covered, everything from animation to SVG to how Flexbox finally feels grid-based design, and everything in between. We're still continuing to release additional speakers and additional talks on Twitter at CSS Conf. And we are really, really hoping that you will be able to come and attend. And also, if you know people that are interested in sponsoring events like this, you should obviously sponsor Boston CSS. But we're also excited that we're going to be able to be bringing some diversity scholarship participants to the conference, people from underprivileged areas that want to be at the conference and didn't necessarily have the means themselves to fly out to Boston and be a part of it. So we're still looking for sponsors to help us bring more people in that regard. So if you pass the word along, certainly we'd love to have you, and we'd also love to for you to let anyone else you know. Please be invited as well.
So we're going to do a brief thing, because I'm the worst. It's true. It's he's met me before. We watched the Fast and Furious the other day. It wasn't great. Yeah. No, it wasn't great. So what we're going to do is give anybody who has an interest in attending CSS Conf one American hundo off the price if you can stump me with the CSS question. Again, I'm the worst. I cannot stress that enough. So first person to throw a hand up.
What does CSS stand for?
That's Cascade Style Sheets. I almost did the Jen Shipper answer. Technically, you would have won. That would have been a trick answer, I think. The couch doesn't get to participate in this.
If you have two divs and they're both displayed inline block with 50%, why will the second one still knock down?
Because it's going to put a weird little padding on it that you can get rid of by doing, what is it, like margin -4 pixels ballpark to get rid of it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
The
The best part is that this is all going to make me incredibly sad. It's going to be like, yeah, no, I know that Android 2.3 bucks. That replaced the memory of my 9th birthday party. Anybody? Somebody? I'm not all that bright, I promise. Better idea. Okay.
Better idea. Anyone at the meetup, Boston_CSS, the same as the Twitter handle for this event, is $25 off for everyone. So we really hope you're able to make it. The 100 off is still valid. You should find Will till later on.
if you can beat me. Arm wrestling.
He's competitive.
That's it. That's basically all I've got, is if you can stump me on CSS or arm wrestle me.
There's no real talk to that, just fight that.
Yeah, that's basically, yeah, not even the CSS thing. Just come up and try and punch me in the face. We're not done. Terrible.
That's what I'll punch you in the face.
It's tougher, actually. Yeah, like, thank you. Anyway, that's it. That's all we got. CSS.com. It's going to be a good time, and spread the word and help us find people to sponsor so more people can go that otherwise might not be able to.
Hope to see you there.
Thank you. So a few other things. We just added, or we got a Twitter, so then if anyone needs updates, we're gonna do it through Boston_CSS. It was on the slides up earlier. And now I'd like to introduce Ethan Marcotte tonight. We're very lucky to have him, and very lucky to have him in the Boston area. I met him a little while ago speaking at the Front-End Design Conf, and he was very nice to join us today. Ethan is a popular speaker and writer, and a highly accomplished web designer. He's most known for coining the term responsive web design, and we're very excited and honored to be hosting him here at Boston. Let's give a warm round of applause to Ethan.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks for setting the expectations low. That was like what you did there. Boston CSS, what's good? A room full of decaf drinkers. This is very exciting. It's a huge honor to be here. I mean, this is a wonderful community that was right in my backyard, and Amanda was wonderful enough to introduce me to it. I'd like to thank Vermonster for hosting me, and to Boku and CSS.com for helping this event happen. So my name is Ethan Marcotte. I'm Beep on Twitter, or at RWD if you don't like the whole GIFs thing. And I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about how I think responsive design is starting to move beyond our devices. To do so, I want to tell you a little bit about an image I recently saw on the internet, because I'm a professional. But this is a rather beautiful image, I think, and a rather special one. This was created in 2012 by a history professor named Ben Schmidt. And I think it's lovely, aesthetically speaking. I mean, it's moving, it's ephemeral. To me, it almost feels a little bit like a snapshot of smoke. The thing is that this isn't just an abstract bit of fluff that somebody traced out in Photoshop. You see, Professor Schmidt actually specializes in visualizing data, specifically so that it can help him better understand the history of the 19th century. So what he did was that he took 2 centuries worth of ocean data, or ocean journeys, and plotted them, traced every journey out, and then overlaid them on top of each other. So the result is what you see in front of you on the screen. 200 years of humanity's maritime exploration collapsed into a single frame, compressed into one image. What I think is even more moving, if you'll pardon the terrible dad joke of a pun, is the time-lapse version of that same image being created in real time by a computer beginning in 1830. So each fleeting or dancing line that you might see on the screen with your eyes is one ship's journey, their port of origin and their destination, the countries they visited along that path, and how long it actually took them to reach it, the countries they visited, they explored, and returned to. And in some cases, those ships don't actually return. I love this image, and I love this story, because I think in a very real and practical sense, human history is founded on exploration, on never being quite satisfied with the status quo, with our current position. We're always kind of looking beyond what we can actually currently reach and grasp to find our next destination. I think as a species, we crave movement, and we crave direction, even when we don't have either of those things. I mention this because I think if I was going to sum up a lot of the discussions I've been having about the state of responsive design over the last few years, or maybe even just the state of the web in general, it would be to distill them down to one question, which is, where are we going? You folks have probably heard some variation on this in recent years, probably in your own work, maybe even today. I mean, at least for me in my practice, like there's usually a little bit of fear in the eyes of the person asking that question, because I think in a very real sense, we were kind of taken off guard by, well, every fucking thing that's been happening over the last couple of years. And we've been dealing with a significant amount of transition and change for a very young industry. We were caught off guard by the explosive rise of mobile here in more developed economies. And there are nearly 8 billion mobile devices estimated to be in use worldwide today. And while tablet computing isn't the newest kid on the block anymore, it's still massively popular, right? I mean, in 2011 alone, in one 12-month period, there were 80 new tablet devices that hit the device marketplace in one single year. That number still floors me. And there's still an incredible amount of excitement and I would say probably a little bit of concern about where we are going next now that we keep moving further and further beyond the desktop, right? There's so much investment and experimentation and trying to figure out what the next big context is going to be. So that's why we're seeing all this investment and excitement in smart TVs, smart watches, other kinds of wearable and embedded computers. You know, these screens that we don't know about today, we're trying to figure out what screens we're going to be designing for in the future. So I don't know how to answer that question about where we're going. What I can do is actually answer the question where I've been going over recent years. Yeah, there's more chairs out front if anyone wants to come in. Because the single biggest change in my practice over the last couple of years is moving away from this idea of pages as the single central organizing principle for designing interfaces for the web, and instead embracing more pattern-driven, more module-focused design practices. And this is, I mean, at least for me as a visual designer, been one of the biggest shifts in the way I think about designing for the web. Because, I mean, historically, I would create a canvas in Photoshop or an Illustrator, and then I'd create some sort of abstract system of columns and rows, and then I just fill it with stuff, with images, with content, with functionality, with all the information that the user actually wants, all based on that sort of canvas-in approach to designing for the web, as Mark Holden calls it. But I think as designers now, we know our design work actually begins a level beneath the page. A friend of mine, Trent Walton, wrote this essay talking about his transition from kind of a responsive design skeptic into somebody who's actually been doing some of the finest responsive design work out there today. That's what I would say. And he talks about how he traded the control he had in Photoshop for a new kind of control. It doesn't say less control, it says a new kind. One in which he could use flexible grids, flexible images, and media queries to build not a page, but a network of content that could be rearranged at any screen size to best convey a message. I love that line, but I love that image because we're no longer building pages. We don't think of our interfaces as these tightly bound, holistic entities that everything sort of changes and adapts at the same rate. Instead, our work begins by understanding the individual components of our design, the individual reusable patterns that we can then stitch together to build more complex interfaces. And some of those patterns might have more breakpoints or more points of adaptation than the other elements around them. And it's by understanding how those tiny little design systems need to change that we can build more complex responsive designs. This really has been the single biggest shift in how I think about designing for the web today. You know, it's influenced the way that I think about design, visually, aesthetically, from a user standpoint, in so many subtle, significant ways. Let me give you one really recent example. So I had the extreme pleasure last year of working on a redesign of Toast, which is an independent publication that sadly just announced that it's closing its doors, but the responsive redesign we did for them is going to stay online, which I'm really excited about. So if you haven't read the Toast, I would totally urge you to do it. It's funny, it's insightful, it's edifying, it's emotional, it's one of the finest publications I've ever worked with. But it is a responsive redesign that is completely flexible, can be viewed on any size screen. But if you spend any amount of time with it, you're going to realize that this design that houses so much content that the Toast published is actually just comprises a few small patterns, right? And some more complex patterns, like the masthead, might change and adapt more frequently and more drastically than, let's say, a headline that appears in the main content realm. So this is a very real and recent example of a pattern-driven responsive design that I worked in recently. Now, if you spend any amount of time on the section front pages or the home page of the website, you're going to see a lot of stuff. You know, because they did publish a significant amount of content. But it's all actually housed by one workhorse of a pattern, one that we call the teaser. You know, something that would basically, you know, sort of tease content from some other part of the magazine, usually an article. Now, the teaser had a whole bunch of different permutations from a pattern standpoint. In its simplest form, it's just a headline that's linked to the article. More often than not, though, it would actually be accompanied by some sort of image to give it a little bit more visual heft. Sometimes, though, it would be accompanied by a prominent number to signify some ranking or some other significance in a larger group of patterns. But then there's the most visually dense one that appears in the main river of content on the homepage, which has a whole bunch of extra content attached to it. Now, if you were to look at these in isolation in the design, you know, every single one of those instances of the teaser looks distinct enough that it could be a different pattern. But under the hood, they're effectively the same entity. They're the same object in the design system. They just have some extra optional attributes that can be bolted on to make them more or less significant to the end user. Now, I just want to call your attention to the most visually dense one, the heftiest version of the teaser, because this is where I kind of like hit this inflection point in the design process for the site, where I just realized like how drastically the way I was thinking about design for the web had changed. And it started out subtly enough, right? Because, I mean, we sort of approved as a team this design for this particular version of the teaser. And the thing that I fell in love with it was kind of that subtle inversion of priorities, right? That the headline, the most important piece of content inside the teaser, is not actually the first piece of information, right? I mean, we're actually leading with metadata before the actual title of the article. So the author's byline, the article category is the very first thing that you see, and then the article comment count appears up at the top right, which is very visually prominent to signify some activity, and then the headline, and then finally the summary of what article we're actually teasing. Now, if someone handed me this design, back in the old days, like 6 months ago, if I was responsible for actually turning this static design into some sort of prototype, I would basically look at this visual order of these different elements and try to match them in my markup, right? So I basically start right at the top with the article byline and category and move down to the comment count, to the title, and then finally the summary. And that's where I caught myself, because I realized that my old way of thinking about marking up content like this was actually wrong. There's this one question that I've been asking myself as I've been doing more responsive design work over the last few years at pretty much every stage of my process. It's been incredibly helpful to me, which is, what if someone doesn't browse the web like I do? Doesn't sound like much, sorry. I don't really have any hot tips for web design, but this has actually been really helpful for me. I mean, if I'm acting as a visual lead on a design project, and I'm working, let's say, on a widescreen comp, for example, in Sketch, asking myself, what if someone doesn't browse the web like I do, is a really great way of sort of like stepping out of that widescreen view of that layout, and maybe just mentally foregrounding the needs of the small screen user at the same time. I may not necessarily be working on those two comps at the exact same moment, but it's helpful for me to just sort of step out of my default assumptions and biases, and to actually just keep in mind that I need to consider other layouts, other breakpoints, other content hierarchies, while I'm working on one view of this responsive design. So going back to our teaser pattern, asking myself, what if someone doesn't browse the web like I do, was a great reminder that not everyone's going to see the web like I do. In other words, if you could think of someone who doesn't actually encounter or see the layout as you and I might, the way in which that I started mocking up this particular version of the pattern was actually the worst way to honor that experience. Because the most important piece of content, we already said, is the article title, and we've effectively buried it in the prototype in this particular markup structure. And then if you could just sort of imagine what the experience would be like if someone's having that content read aloud to them in a speaking browser. Imagine how disorienting it would be to actually have the byline and the comment count read aloud before you actually encounter the article title they're associated with. It's a little bit less than optimal. So this was like again, kind of like a recent reminder for me that if you're doing any responsive design or front-end development work, I think it's incumbent upon us today to start by designing the content priority that we're trying to honor, independent of the layout that we're trying to serve to our site users. So with that reminder in place, I could kind of go back to the layout and put the layout itself aside. And instead of focusing just on the visual priority of those elements, I could really sort of step back from the layout and think about the content hierarchy underneath the design itself. So again, putting aside the visual layout, the most important piece of content in here is, again, the article title. And then I would say that the second most important piece of information is actually the byline and the category that's associated with that title. And then I made the decision that the summary was actually the third most important piece of content, and that the least important piece of information was the one that was the most visually prominent, the comment count. But from a hierarchy standpoint, I decided it was actually the least important of all those 4 pieces of content. You and I could probably have a decent debate afterwards about how terrible an idea that was, or maybe we differ on the placement of a couple of those items, but at least once I'd settled on some sort of sorting order for this particular teaser, I could then go back and sort of step back from the layout and instead come up with a lightly styled prototype that matched the content hierarchy that I felt was most deserving for this particular piece of content of the teaser. I could lightly style it to match the typography, and then I could basically move into the prototype, start with the article title, move to the byline, and then have the summary. And then I made the decision to actually nest the comment count directly within the summary. So it is quite literally the last piece of information inside this particular teaser. Now, if I showed this prototype to the client, I would have been fired. This isn't what we as a team sort of said was the best design to put forward, right? And this is not what they approved. But this is the foundation that we can use to build on to move up to that top shelf experience. So with this basic content hierarchy in place, what I could then do is I could just sort of surround the two most important pieces of information, the title and the byline, with some sort of containing element, class to this teaser head. And with those two elements as children, what I could then do is basically use a little bit of like Flexbox work to sort of fix the content priority. So within that container, I could basically just declare it as a flexible box, and then I could just use simple flex direction column reverse, which basically acts as like a reverse of the gravity within that container. So then the article byline is essentially just going to shoot it right up to the top of the container, and the title is going to move down to the bottom. But that's just on the visual layer. The actual underlying structure of the HTML hasn't changed at all. Now, Flexbox is great. I use it heavily in my work. And what's really wonderful about it is that I had more elements within that container. I could be really prescriptive about where they fall in the visual order by using the order property, right? This is fairly straightforward flexible box work. The only problem with Flexbox, though, is it doesn't do anything for elements that sit all the way outside of my flexible box, like my comment count, which is the very last piece of content inside of this teaser. Ideally, what I'd like to see happen is that if a browser understands Flexbox, I want to take that comment count out of its default position and anchor it to the top right corner of this containing of the teaser. So to figure out if the browser actually understands Flexbox, what I decided to do was ask the browser if it understood Flexbox. So I wrote a simple little modernizer style question in JavaScript, basically looking for certain I'm getting there.
Sorry.
I'm getting there. I know. We can talk more about that afterwards. Yes. Anyway, so basically I'm looking for certain properties of Flexbox that I need to introduce in my design and actually incorporate in my design. And if the browser passes that test and says, yes, I support these properties, then we apply we apply an extra class to the HTML that supports Flex. And so that means that I can conditionally apply these more advanced rules with just a little bit of totally lost my rhythm there. If that class is present, if the browser passes that test, then we can apply Flexbox or display Flex to that containing element. But more importantly, we can do simple absolute positioning, take that comment count out of its default position, and move it up to the top right corner. In other words, what I'm talking about here is starting with a baseline structure and layout that honors the content priority that we feel is actually most important, independent of the visual presentation. But then we can take elements that maybe aren't in the ideal position from a layout standpoint, and if they pass that little check in JavaScript and that class is actually present, then we can enhance the layout a little bit further. We can move the byline up to the top and the article title underneath it, and more importantly, use positioning to take the comment count out of its default position and anchor it up into the top right. Now, as my good friends in the front row have noticed, I'm introducing a little bit of fragility into the design here, right? Because this is actually reliant on JavaScript. And this is not necessarily problematic, I would say. But you can't necessarily count on that JavaScript actually executing in every environment, right? This introduces a little bit of fragility, obviously. If the code doesn't execute, or if there's an error in the code, which is very likely because I wrote some of it, that layout may not necessarily enhance as I intended. But maybe that's okay, because the content's still accessible. What I'm excited about, as Leah and Chris just mentioned, though, is that we're very soon getting this ability to make some of these decisions directly inside of CSS, right? We've been writing media queries for some time in our responsive designs, but very soon we're going to be able to write feature queries, where we can actually interrogate the user agent, and in our styles, basically say, do you support property value pairs like display flex? And if it passes that test and says, yes, I actually understand Flexbox, then it will conditionally enhance the layout a little bit further. Now, feature queries are wonderful. I've started using them for more advanced layout rules, like grid layout, for example. This is a really nice sort of like feature break for them. This is, unfortunately, though, feature queries are kind of like a flag for evergreen browsers. So they're not supported in Internet Explorer. They don't work in Opera Mini, or in older versions of Android, which are all very popular. And maybe that's okay, but because of the the visual parity that we're trying to serve up to Internet Explorer, that's why we ended up going with the JavaScript-driven solution here. But this is something that I'm very excited to start working with very widely in my designs in the next couple of years. But the thing is that at least you could probably have a decent debate about the implementation tack that I took here. But I think at the end of the day, the important thing to walk away from with this particular pattern is that supporting the browser doesn't necessarily mean that every single browser gets the exact same experience. And I think that this has been at the heart of every responsive design scale over the last couple of years. You know, The Guardian is one example of this in action, and they use an extensive amount of flexbox and all these really beautifully composed, grid-heavy layouts that they have on their homepage and all their section fronts. And this is really artfully done. And we can actually just sort of talk through how they've taken this sort of semi-responsive layout and incorporated some of that flexbox work without compromising access for slightly older browsers. So if I could just turn your attention to this, let's take this one particular module that appears right at the top of the homepage. And actually, I'm going to make one quick alteration here. Anyway, this particular module is laid out with Flexbox, and they've basically done a really lovely job with it. This is a sort of an example of a practice that they've walked through with this pattern in different parts of their design. But if we were going to sort of do a quick content inventory, they're leading with textual information from that lead story, and then there's some sort of image associated with that lead story. And then running along underneath that lead content is the footer of related links and information. Now, if you were to do that breakdown, you would sort of be forgiven for thinking that the content is actually the first piece of content inside that particular pattern. But actually, they've made a decision editorially that the image is actually the most important piece of content in that particular block, and so it appears first in the markup. And then the content, and then finally the footer that runs underneath. Now, they're actually managing this with even more lightweight flexbox work. They're applying it to the entire module, and then essentially using flex direction row reverse, whereas before we used column reverse to sort of change the gravity on the horizontal axis. They're using it to switch position of the image and the content so that the image shoots off to the right and the content to the left, without changing the underlying content priority inside that particular pattern. Now, by doing this, they're actually able to really drastically change the layout on these modules across different breakpoints with just a couple property values. But the important thing to note here, though, is that this is, again, a conditionally enhanced layout. They've run a couple small little JavaScript checks to see if the browser supports flexbox writ large, and then if it supports flexwrap in particular. And if it passes both of those tests, then they can conditionally enhance the layout up into this nice, really tightly composed version we see here. But if it fails that test, or maybe the code doesn't actually ever reach the browser through a network fault or an error in the code, they're still going to be left with a baseline foundational experience that maybe isn't the most complex layout in the world, but it also ensures that there's something usable, something accessible underneath that really refined top-level version of that UI. Again, the implementation details you might quibble with, right? But at the end of the day, and I think in 2016, now more than ever, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that our responsive designs are as device agnostic as possible. Now, device agnostic is kind of a broad term. It's maybe a little bit of a buzzword these days, said the guy who coined the term responsive design. But my friend Trent Walton, who I cited before, wrote this really moving essay about how device agnostic thinking can actually be a really valuable guiding design principle for the modern web. He said that there's more to devices than just the size of their screens. A device-agnostic approach also takes into account infinite combinations of screen resolution, input method, browser capability, and connection speed. Does anyone else have a little pit of fear in their stomachs right now? I mean, what Trent is saying is that designing flexible, responsive layouts is just the first step for designing for the modern web, that we have all these adverse conditions that we have to design for. We're dealing with hostile browsers. If you think of browsers as almost allergic to preserving your design, it's actually a much better way to think about designing for them. We're dealing with screens that are incredibly wide and also smaller than they ever have been before. We're dealing with networks that are incredibly slow and spotty, and we're dealing with more input mechanisms than we've ever had to think about before in the web's very short history. And so then Trent continues, and he basically says that like cars designed to perform in extreme heat or on icy roads, websites should be built to face the reality of the web's inherent variability. I love that line. I've been saying for the last couple of years in my writings and in my talks that the web is the first truly flexible design medium. But it's only in recent years that I've understood that flexibility encompasses more than just layout. You know, it has to encompass other kinds of experiences as well, and it has to encompass the most adverse conditions in the web as it exists today. You know, we think a lot about designing for certain devices and for certain networks. But I don't think we often consider, like Ericsson, for example, has been pointing out for quite some time that the web is much slower than we might like to think it is. That a full 60% of the world's mobile data connections are sub 3G. And if we're not designing for that as a baseline, maybe we're not necessarily meeting up with the expectations of what the real web actually looks like today. Scott Gell said on Twitter somewhat recently that we don't disable JavaScript when we're testing and designing our sites, just to test how a site works with JavaScript disabled, as if that's a thing anybody actively does, right? We do it to test how a site works, he says, in non-ideal net and browsing conditions. And it's that word non-ideal that I love, and it's something that I've been trying to incorporate in my own practice responsibly a little bit more. Because we tend to talk about our designs in exclusively ideal terms, and we don't talk about the non-ideal as much as we'd like to. In fact, the three most common words that I hear on any responsive design project are ideals: mobile, tablet, and desktop. Does anyone want to guess what the three least helpful words in talking about responsive design are? I have nothing but dad jokes for you. They're the exact same words. It's not that these words are bad, but it's that they're wrong. Right? If you go into a room full of stakeholders and you ask them all to just define what mobile means for them, you're probably going to get very different definitions across that entire room. And what's more, every single one of these terms actually conceals specific conditions or features that we need to be designing for. And so a lot of my work in recent years has been working with clients to kind of step back from these really overbroad device classes and instead hone in on the specific conditions and features that we need to encompass or plan for it when we're talking about how our responsive designs need to adapt. So for example, talking about the input method on the device independent of the actual screen size that's available to it, or the speed of the network independent of its quality. You know, so for example, if you were to ask one of your clients how to define mobile, chances are fairly good that you get a set of features or conditions kind of that would fall stereotypically along the left-hand side of the table, right? You're dealing with a small touch-based screen that's usually on the slower end of the bandwidth spectrum, and that's maybe not on the most reliable network. But what about mobile devices that are actually on a fairly reliable network, right? They're on an office Wi-Fi connection, or you're on your home network. That's also a mobile use case. Or what if someone doesn't actually see the screen, as you and I might, and they're actually having the contents of our pages read aloud to them by, let's say, VoiceOver on iOS. That's also a mobile use case, and one that I would say that we haven't been serving very well in the last few years. Desktop is just as problematic as mobile, right? We think of these widescreen devices with a keyboard and mouse attached to them that are on fairly reliable network connections. But what if that desktop device is actually tethered to a 3G antenna? Maybe I'm sitting in a coffee shop and tethered to my phone. Maybe I'm on hotel Wi-Fi. Folks here in Boston, I mean, everyone who commutes into the city on a commuter rail, you have Wi-Fi on those trains that is terrible. But that's a desktop use case. I mean, low bandwidth connections aren't exclusively the domain of the mobile user, whatever that means. So we need to talk about these things in a slightly decoupled way. Or maybe that laptop device doesn't actually have a keyboard and mouse attached to it, or maybe they're using a touchscreen on a more modern piece of hardware. This is all to basically say that thinking in a device-agnostic fashion is going to better prepare you for some of the adverse conditions on the web. And this is something that was a guiding principle for us on the Toast, because we spent 95% of our time working on this top-shelf version of the responsive design that you might see on the screen in front of you. But we still wanted to make sure that there was going to be something usable there. If a piece of code didn't successfully reach the end user, or if there was an error in the code, or if they were on a slightly less modern device or browser, we ensured that there was a small screen version of the design that was served up to everybody by default. This is the foundational experience for the Toast that we could conditionally enhance up into the design that we actually invested most of our time in. So I think we could be looking for more opportunities to design for the non-ideal. And I've been talking a lot about text-heavy websites where the primary transaction is reading. But this kind of thinking actually applies to more interactive experiences as well. I've been told in recent years I've been working on a lot of web applications. I still don't know what a web application is, but let's say you have an element of a more transactional interface that might live by default as a series of radio buttons with a form or cancel button attached to them. There's nothing to preclude you from taking that accessible, maybe uninteresting looking foundation and then enhancing it up into something that's maybe a little bit more refined, has a little bit of that animation thing all the kids are talking about today. I don't talk to a lot of kids. That meets the needs of the modern web user, meets their expectations for what a modern UI should do. Or maybe you're designing a responsive navigation system, right? And by default, maybe on slightly older devices or browsers, it's just a series of skip links that bring you down to the bottom of the page where the navigation natively resides. But then in certain devices and browsers, in certain more enhanced environments, then you can refine that experience a little bit more off of that baseline content hierarchy and expand or collapse the menu in place. In other words, that kind of device-agnostic thinking is going to better prepare not just the patterns that you're designing, but the responsive sites that you're designing. for the adverse conditions of the web. As you're designing every single one of these patterns, ask yourselves that question: what if someone doesn't actually browse the web like I do? It's going to give you design patterns and responsive sites that are actually much more, not just responsive, but resilient to some of the adverse conditions we face on the web. Now, I've been talking a lot about implementation and layout, but the dirty little secret about responsive design today, I would say, is actually that designing and building a responsive layout isn't our biggest challenge anymore. That's not to say that we've solved every problem or that things aren't about to get really interesting. We have a lot of great layout tools that are coming down the pipe that I can't wait to start using on the regular. But as responsive design moves in more and more to the mainstream, as larger teams start working with responsive interfaces, I would actually say that the biggest challenge I see in my practice, both as a designer and working with clients, the biggest challenge for a responsive designer today is documenting and communicating how, why, and when our responsive designs are going to adapt. So that's why in recent years, I think we've been seeing, like, as responsive design gets more popular, kind of this dovetailing with the rise of the style guide. Now, you or your team could call it style guides, maybe someone else's team calls it pattern libraries. Unfortunately, this is one of those areas where the English language has completely failed us. I tend to use these terms like interchangeably. I read the room and I sort of switch accordingly. But one of the earliest examples of a large-scale style guide that was released along with the responsive design was for Starbucks. So Starbucks.com responsibly redesigned back in 2011. They had a lovely, slightly heavy responsive design. But the thing that they did that I was most excited about at the time was they released their style guide. So you could basically go through and sort of see whether you actually worked at Starbucks on their digital team or if you were completely external to the company. You could see how all these individual responsive patterns worked in isolation from each other. And then you can also understand how they fit together to become progressively more complex, to build a completely responsive version of Starbucks.com. A more recent example that I really love is Ushihidi's pattern library. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend checking it out. Now, Ushihidi develops open source software for data visualization and interactive mapping. It's used across the planet, especially in a lot of emerging markets. And this is one of the more refined looking style guides I've seen in recent years. And again, it's a really lovely illustration of how discrete, tiny little components can be sort of attached to each other over time to be made more complex and built all the way up into headers or footers or embedded maps. So that's why I would actually go so far as to say that a pattern library or a style guide has kind of become the de facto artifact that results from a responsive redesign. And there's so many benefits of actually building one of these documents, right? I mean, everything from creating a central shared repository of all the code and design patterns that go into building these layouts that result in more cohesive and consistent interfaces. But they have organizational benefits as well. They bridge collaboration gaps between design and engineering teams. They can also help with onboarding people who need to orient themselves in your design system. Now, if you want to actually invest the time in creating a style guide or pattern library, and maybe if you've done so, you know there's a lot of work to do. But I think at the high level, there's really kind of just a three-step process for creating a style guide. It begins with a visual inventory of every single pattern in your responsive site, and then naming and organizing every single one of those patterns in a logical and clear way. And then finally actually producing the style guide, translating that visual inventory into HTML and CSS so it can be a web-native document. Let me just walk through those really quickly. So first and foremost, a visual inventory, everyone kind of has their own process. There's a lot of hand-waving around creating a visual inventory. This could happen at the start of a responsive redesign or closer to the end when you finalize the visual framework. But basically all it means is you're sort of browsing through a responsive site or a site that's about to become responsive, and then kind of copying and pasting every single pattern you can identify into some sort of document, whether it's Photoshop or Sketch or Keynote, what have you. Some more code-savvy people I've worked with tend to prefer to actually just copy and paste HTML and CSS into some sort of standalone template specifically. But basically what you're looking for is not every single headline or every single link. You're looking for those unique treatments of them, the unique patterns that are reused across the entire visual language. Once you've done that dump, though, then the work really begins, because you need to actually name every single one of those patterns, but maybe more importantly, look for associations between those patterns. Group like patterns with like patterns, and apply clear logical names that can allow you or other members of your digital team to quickly refine and identify those patterns. And then finally, translating the inventory itself into HTML and CSS. Now, when I worked on the Toast, I mean, we actually had a fairly small number of patterns that we spun up to create all these pages for the responsive redesign. So what we did was we basically created one short static HTML document that contained all the patterns. and handed it off to them. So they could quickly sort of access not just the visual layout, see how it was going to adapt and change, but also get at the code underneath them. And shout out to Matt Marcus, who's in the back, who's involved with CSS.conf for the lovely X-Ray HTML plugin that is some fine work there. Now, like I said, this is a static document. It was a copy-paste job for me, which is not necessarily ideal when you're maintaining these at scale. You want these documents to be evergreen, to change and adapt as your responsive redesign changes and adapts over time. Thankfully, we're kind of living in a golden age of automation and instrumentation for maintaining automated style guides. A recent example of this would be DevBridge's style guide, and this is a really refined piece of work. And basically what it does is it's actually scraping a lot of these modules and patterns directly from SAS files. Now, there are a lot of tools that operate like this. I'm mainly kind of including this one because I like that sort of like in-browser resizing thing. I'm sorry for that. It's really refined from a UI standpoint. But the mechanics under the hood are actually, basically you're sort of linting your CSS descriptively with sort of some sort of standardized syntax. And there's a whole host of them out there. KSS is a popular one. There's also style.o and style down. Regardless of the format that you end up adopting, basically what it means is you're sort of like, again, kind of describing what certain selectors actually do in context in some sort of established format. And then there's some sort of utility that would then go through this and actually build the style guide for you. Another example that I'm really watching with keen interest just got released about 2 weeks ago, which is Fractal. This is developed by Clear Left in the UK. Fractal.build is the URL, and I'm watching this with a lot of interest because it kind of promotes a component-first design process. It's basically like a little, CMS for design patterns. So once you register a component in Fractal, you can actually build a style guide, obviously, but it can also publish out to other platforms. So if you have other products or other endpoints that are going to be referencing your style guide, you can actually integrate your style guide a little bit more effectively with them over time. This is Airbnb's AirShots utility that they designed in-house, and this is fancy. I mean, this basically allows them to quickly review different patterns in context at different device sizes and using different language sets. They have suggested on Twitter that they're going to be open sourcing this, and I cannot wait for that to happen. It's going to be Christmas and all the other holidays kind of wrapped into one. But I mean, this is just a small subset of all the experimentation that's happening with solving this problem about how we can actually maintain and deploy style guides at scale. If you're interested in this topic in any detail, I would refer you to Susan Robertson's A List of Part article, where you get a roundup of different style guide generators. It's got really wonderful resources in there. But I wanted to cover this briefly because I think in our industry, there's actually a considerable amount of literature dedicated to the first and third steps in the process of creating a style guide, right? There's lots of writing and talks out there about creating a visual inventory and how to manage that process. And then finally, how to actually produce and automate the production of that style guide. But I'm kind of curious for myself, at least, if maybe our priorities are a little bit misplaced. Because at least for me in my practice, the most important part of this process is the one that I don't think we talk a lot about as an industry, which is the middle step, the naming and organization of every single one of those patterns. A designer named Ala Kolmatova recently wrote that modularity might appear to be a simple concept at first. Create a style guide, deploy it, right? It's great, create this document. But actually making it work for your team, she says, demands significant effort and commitment. She goes on to say that language is fundamental to collaboration. In short, we should start with language, not interfaces. I think she's right. And this actually reminds me of a story I recently read about a boat. So this is the Huckle layout, and it's actually a large voyaging canoe, which is powered exclusively and only by the wind in its sails. It's a completely analog boat. But in 1976, the crew actually managed to, they decided to take it on a very scenic, but also an incredibly difficult journey. Because they decided that they were going to travel between 2 points on the Pacific Ocean, specifically 2 island nations, Hawaii and Tahiti, which are separated by some 2,500 miles. And if you or I were to fly between them, it would take about 9.5 hours to cross that distance. And the Huckleya made that journey in 30 days. Now, what was remarkable about that journey wasn't its distance or its length, but rather that they did it without the aid of any modern navigational equipment. No sextants, no compasses, no modern maps, and back in 1976, definitely no computer-aided navigation. Now, they were able to do this incredibly difficult and incredibly analog journey thanks to one man in particular, a man named Pius Mau Piaila, Now, Mao was a navigator from a small island called Satawal in Micronesia. And he was actually schooled in traditional Polynesian navigation techniques, techniques that the crew of the Hokulea were actually trying to honor with their journey. Now, these techniques were hundreds and hundreds of years old, based on navigating the sea by the stars, by the position of the sun and the moon, or if they couldn't actually see the sky due to clouds, by studying the direction of the water in front of them. And one of the most important instruments in Mao's tradition never actually made it onto the boat with him. It was something that was called a star compass, which was a circle of rocks or shells with a point fixed in the center. Now, I have a very brief video of him using this in a teaching context. I just want to play for you really quickly. Anyone getting any audio? Yeah. Okay. Anyway. I'm just going to call that a failed AV experiment. Anyway, if you could actually hear it, basically what's happening is that as someone, either Mao or one of the students, is pointing at every one of those circles, there's a chant that's happening. And basically what's happening is that every single stone in the compass represents one constellation in the sky. And the point in the center of the compass actually represents the boat that the navigator and his crew will be sitting on. Now, the chant that you may or may not have been able to hear was actually Mao naming every single one of the stars in turn, basically to help navigators and those studying with him better understand the sky and the boat's position relative to it. So this is how navigators in Mao's tradition actually learned, through song, through repetition. But more importantly, I think it's because they were developing a shared common language as part of a tradition, right? This established consistency across generations, across centuries. It allowed every single navigator in that tradition over time to make decisions because they'd internalized the sky when they're out on the water and the star compass was back on land behind them. Turning back to Olive, who's actually talking about design patterns, she said that the process of naming an element, it works out the function as a group and reaches an agreement. It's not so much about giving something a great name, although that's something to aspire to, but it's the actual process of agreeing on the name as a team. An effective name actually determines how the element will be used and helps to ensure that it's going to be used consistently by everyone who's working with that style guide. The biggest challenges around modular design aren't creating a style guide or actually doing visual inventory. It's all the decisions and questions that you're going to have to be faced with when you've actually produced that style guide and released it into the world. How do you actually use that style guide on a daily basis? So determining when you're going to reuse a module that already exists in the style guide, or when you actually need to design a new one. How to make modules distinct enough from each other. How to avoid duplications with the modules other designers and teams create, and so on. I think the battery died. Use a handheld? Lovely.
Check, check. Okay. So in other words, naming and language are what will enable you to do that. They create that shared understanding about what these modules do and what your style guide can actually do for you, which is then going to create a more consistent design. I mentioned this because in recent years, one of the more common ways for actually managing this process is something called atomic design, which is a framework that was invented by Brad Frost a few years ago. And if you're somebody like me who doesn't understand chemistry and barely understands web design, this is actually a really beautiful metaphor for articulating how very tiny components can become more complex over time and eventually build up into full pages, right? So to borrow Brad's metaphor, right, you've got atoms, which are basically just single HTML elements. And then you basically combine multiple atoms and make them progressively more complex over time, and eventually spin them up into full templates and full page layouts. It's a beautiful visual metaphor. But what I've been encountering in my practice over the last few years is that organizations working with atomic design at scale find it introduces potential collaboration issues. So for example, let's say you're working through a visual inventory and you have a responsive design, and you have one pattern in particular you need to catalog. Let's say it's this search pattern that appears at the top of this responsive site. And this is a really beautiful piece of work, right? Because on wider screens, it's a completely flexible component. And on smaller screens, it actually collapses down to a show-hide mechanic with a lovely little bit of animation work. This is a really well thought out design pattern. It needs to be cataloged and slotted somewhere into this overall hierarchy. Now, if we were working from an atomic design mindset, this introduces a potential for classification problem. Because it's pretty easy to see that working with Brad's metaphor that, this is not a single atom. This isn't one single HTML element. It's too complex for that. And it's obviously not a full template, it's not a full page layout, so it's not on the other end of the spectrum either. So it sits somewhere in the middle. It's either a molecule or a component. Unfortunately, the framework around atomic design isn't really clear where slightly complex elements like this should fall. And this is where that collaboration issue potentially comes into play. This is not a huge issue. This is not a world-changing problem, right? I mean, you know, probably every single one of us in this room could find a place for this in the atomic design framework. But chances are very good we wouldn't all have the same answer. And this is the problem that a lot of my clients actually tend to run into, that these patterns don't necessarily prescribe themselves neatly into one of these spots. Now, some organizations that use atomic design have sort of worked their way around this by introducing some sort of translation layer. And Dan Mall talked about this in a responsive redesign that he did with a client recently, that they ended up making a group glossary for their project. That this is the definition for an atom, that this is the definition for a molecule, so that they all knew how to think about those things. I think this is a really great workaround, but not every organization, especially at larger scales, has the option to do this. Trent Walton wrote about this, that basically that the team struggled to map components to an atomic classification, which made collaboration within the project difficult. We paused to recalculate proper classification before talking about a component. John O'Harrington, who runs a small digital agency, basically said that the team totally bought into the core concepts of atomic design, but when it came down to what each of these components meant, it didn't make sense to them. It was too hard to relate these different terms to the overall big picture. This is a reminder for me, at least, that a style guide's success or failure often hinges on the words that we use to talk about it. Now, regardless of the terms that you and your teams use, whether it's atoms and molecules or blocks and components, before you commit to any kind of metaphor, whether you created it or whether it's external to your organization, make sure that every single member of your team actually understands what those words mean and shares that same level of understanding. So maybe for you and your team, atomic design provides that level of clarity, and that's great. But what I'm seeing more often, though, in my practice, is that many companies are actually investing the time and resources to design language, design metaphors to actually manage their style guides internally. Because at the end of the day, a good style guide uses language and metaphors that are going to be meaningful to your organization, to the people responsible for maintaining it. So I've been doing a poor karaoke act for Alec Holmatova's really wonderful article on the language of modular design. If you take nothing else away from this like weird little song and dance routine I'm doing, go check out this article, because it's a really wonderful solution to this particular problem. Because what she talks about is how visual inventories, the very start of creating a pattern library, are often described as kind of like an individual exercise, right? Like an enterprising designer or developer is sort of breaking down an interface and just kind of runs off and does that work. But all it actually says is that the real power of doing that exercise is making it a collaborative exercise. So as an entire group, review every single module in your design system, and then name those things collaboratively, based on their high-level function. And she basically said that this can actually tease out some interesting conflicts, because they actually encountered one doing this exercise. They had one module that had been designed to promote online courses, and then another module to promote discussion. Kind of look similar, right? I mean, aesthetically speaking, they're kind of unique and they're idiosyncratic. They've been designed by different designers and different teams. But while they had a similar style, they actually had a similar function. So this collaborative review actually not just teased out this potential conflict, but actually got everyone around understanding the fact that they were actually trying to do the same thing with two different patterns. Namely, they were trying to focus users' attention on one distinct action. So that's why they could actually come up with a replacement module called Billboard. So in other words, through this collaborative review, their team uncovered a conflict and then recommended a replacement as a team that was actually better than the two modules that preceded it. Because this new module is no longer restricted by its position on the page or by the content inside of it. And what's more important, though, than the pattern itself is that this new module's high-level function is understood by everybody who was involved in that collaborative review. In other words, that kind of what we're trying to do with these more collaborative processes is actually integrate your design language into every single part of your company culture. And if you can do that, you're going to actually reap some very tactical benefits that all outlines in her article. But if I was going to be so bold as to actually just tack one more onto her list, is that the benefit to working through your design system in a collaborative fashion is that it actually can help your team articulate the design principles that your organization actually holds dear. Because the benefit to that is that we've been managing a ridiculous amount of transition in the last few years as we've moved from pages to patterns. And design principles are what's going to help us getting further through that process. It's going to help us define patterns that we don't know that we need today, and also design for devices that we haven't even invented yet. Now, thankfully, some responsive organizations have been starting this process and talking about how design principles have been a really key factor for them in their process. So Vox Media is actually a really wonderful example of this. They have a number of responsive brands and publications that they manage, each one of them pattern-driven responsive sites, and they're all beautiful and distinct in their own right, but they're all drawing from a relatively shared number of patterns. So they actually have kind of a unit test process that they put new patterns through, and they use design principles to effectively vet new patterns that they might be introducing to their sites. And so their patterns are, their design principles are very well articulated. Is this new pattern necessary? Is it unique enough to warrant inclusion in the style guide? Is it reusable enough not just to live on multiple pages, but maybe to be pulled out of the site that it was originally designed for and live on other sites entirely? Is it clear enough? And when they say clear, they don't mean just to the end users, but also to the people that are going to be designing or maintaining that module over time. Is it responsive enough to work on multiple devices? Is it accessible enough to people who don't encounter the web like we do? Airbnb, who's also doing some really lovely cross-device responsive work, has some very well-articulated design principles, which are unified, universal, iconic, and conversational. They're very broad-sounding terms, but they actually have very distinct meanings for people working at Airbnb. Alex Schleifer basically said that unified and universal define the system's approach we apply when defining patterns. Is it part of a greater whole? Does it work across devices? Iconic and conversational help define the character of the system, its unique human qualities that tie back to our community brand values. The benefit to having this conversation about principles is that you can actually elevate your pattern libraries beyond just a simple collection of snippets and code and into a formal design system. Because what you're trying to do is actually build a compass for your organization, not just a document that represents the current version of your website. Because at the end of the day, I mean, none of us can answer this question, where are we going? I don't know. I don't know if anybody in this room knows. But what I do know is that the web doesn't evolve in a single straight line, and it never really has. You know, it's not a relentless cycle of device upgrades and browser versions. We've seen remarkable advances the further we've moved past the desktop, but at every step of that process, though, we need to be checking some of our assumptions about how the web's moving. Because it's true, the mobile landscape has been exploding in recent years, and that doesn't seem to be changing anymore. But it's also worth noting, though, that most of that traffic hasn't been coming at the expense of desktop. It's been additive rather than reductive. And while there's still an incredible amount of excitement around tablet computing, there's been a lot of speculation, both from market analysts and also from tablet manufacturers, that the tablet market might be softening, if not in an outright decline. And while there's a lot of post-desktop experimentation, there hasn't been one single thing that's achieved anything like we've seen with mobile computing in recent years. And what's more, we've been sort of shown on a daily basis that our definition of mobile is much narrower than we might not need it to be. You know, in the Syrian refugee crisis, one of the greatest humanitarian crises of our time, there have been all these harrowing photographs coming out of these terrible journeys that people have been on. But one of the through lines through them has been mobile devices. And these devices are actually being used to garner safe passage through incredibly difficult journeys, or maybe to connect with loved ones and families when they've actually completed these journeys. And all these devices are smartphones in every sense of the word, but they're also far less powerful and far less expensive than the ones you and I might be designing for by default on a daily basis. So that's why I think I'm most excited that our industry seems to be slowly turning toward this phrase, the next billion. That the next billion people to be coming online aren't going to be coming from Western markets like Western Europe and the United States. A designer and researcher who I really respect and admire, a woman named Em Chaomino, said that this is the big challenge facing our industry in the coming years. That some of the next billion to come online are taking boats across the Mediterranean, the South China Sea, and elsewhere. They will have smartphones. So, in the next few years, let's absolutely create more pattern-driven responsive sites informed by well-articulated, device-agnostic design principles. If we can do that, we're going to ensure that our work can move beyond our devices and will be accessible on theirs. So let's start designing for them today. Because honestly, if we're looking for stars to set our ships by, can't think of better ones than those. I'd like to thank you very much for your time tonight. if you sat through that talk and you enjoyed any part of it, I did have a book come out at the end of last year that talks a lot about these things in great detail. If you hated the talk, the book's okay.
Oh, yeah, sure. Taking questions? I made it weird. So we're going to do some questions. I know that someone's moderating an online Q&A as well. I'll take one question right here.
How are people being responsive for very bandwidth and really slow network connections?
So the question was, how are people sort of considering bandwidth when they're working responsively, or being responsive about bandwidth? I'd say a couple things. We're getting a whole host of really wonderful tools to be a little bit more sensitive to the amount of data we're actually delivering down to end users. Matt Marcotte, who was kind of, with some other people, actually responsible for getting a responsive images specification in place that allows us to be a little bit more sensitive about the size of the images we're serving up. But the single biggest tool that's been helpful for me isn't actually a technical one. It's actually been talking with clients at the start of a redesign about a performance budget. So actually getting them to set down in plain English, how do we define good performance for this site? You know, making sure that we don't exceed the size of a certain of pages, or more often than not, it's about like how quickly we can get content into the browser under certain network conditions. That gives us a sort of an acid test that we can basically run prototypes through at every stage of the process, so that if we could ever exceed that budget, we can have a conversation about how to actually get things back down. So the technical stuff is out there and valuable, but I think it's having a broad discussion about bandwidth sort of throughout the process is really helpful. So, yeah. Hey, Chris.
So firstly, really great talk, nicely delivered, great visuals, loved it.
Thank you.
Secondly, I really liked the first example you gave, which is a perfect answer to the accessibility people who say, but CSS lets you change the reading order, and that's terrible. And
right.
you gave an exact counterexample to why that actually helps rather than hinders. So thank you. My actual question.
Sure.
You talked about style guides, and you talked about how and why. And you showed style guides that answered very precisely how, without explaining why. Why do we do this? Why does when this happens, this happens? The style guides told you what to do, but not why it was being done, what the design process was. Do you have anything to offer on that?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. Thank you. So there was sort of Chris rightly noted a lot of the style guide examples I was showing didn't address the why of these patterns, right? I think I've been seeing more recently some examples of style guides that are actually trying to address that problem. So one of the more visible examples recently, Salesforce came out with their design system that doesn't actually foreground patterns at first. It really actually walks the user through why we went through this exercise, the value of doing this. Because I mean, there's so many organizational benefits to going through this exercise, more consistent interfaces, a lot of ambiguity gets taken out of the design process at scale. And I think painting that picture before actually just diving into front-end snippets is something that I've seen more organizations do. So I would blame a poor presenter for culling some pattern-driven approaches, but there are examples out there that speak to that. So thank you. I appreciate that. Any other questions? Do we want to do any online questions, or are there any that I scare off the internet?
There's no questions online.
Sweet. I can retire now. Any other questions in here? Yeah.
I can ask a question. So,
please.
For a small project or a first version of a project, how that's limited in time and scope probably. Like, how much of this would you recommend thinking of doing or doing? Or yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the actual formal process of going through a style guide, I think it's a valuable one, but I also live in the real world, so that if there isn't like hours or money, at the end of the day to actually go through that process, I think that's a constraint that has to be acknowledged. At the same time, though, I think like designing with an eye toward reuse is something that is really valuable anyway. So even if you can't actually create that physical document, thinking about, I don't know, a particular module that could maybe change position or be reused in different parts of the design is really kind of that's the end goal, that the pattern library is effectively formalizing that. But again, some of those automation tools might cut down on some of the time and investment that needs to happen. That's what's kind of exciting to me about it. But yeah, I don't think it's a must-have, but I think it's a valuable thing to do if there's time, resources for it. Thank you. Yeah.
What kind of exercises do you go through to find or evolve your design patterns and figure out your information architecture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've gotten a lot more tactile with clients, and I actually skipped over a section that talks about this specifically. So, Ala Kolmatova's article that I sort of cited before is a really great articulation for why to go through this process. Another one that I would recommend is From Pages to Patterns. It's an article by Charlotte Jackson. And basically, she introduces a game where it helps sort of like introduce this idea of pattern-driven design to less technical actors. It basically starts as like an arts and crafts project, so cutting up printouts of pages and working with people to identify patterns. And then actually the real goal of this is actually to work through like a collaborative naming exercise. So once you've actually like identified a pattern, get a group of people together, write down on a post-it note how you would name this pattern, and then actually just have everyone reveal their options, and then discuss the relative strengths and weaknesses of every single one of those. The benefit to that is like, it kind of like engenders that idea of design principles, right? It starts talking about, well, and I think that's maybe a little bit too visually presentational heavy for a name, or maybe it's not, maybe it's too functional. And it sort of like helps establish a broad consensus about how to think about this pattern-driven approach. And then you kind of work up to sort of larger pieces of artwork from there. But yeah, there are a whole host of games out there that I play, and that's just one of them. I found that one really valuable. Thank you. Hi.
I really liked what you were saying about style guides and how the practice of going through things is valuable in itself. Choosing names, finding words. So my question is, who participates in that? Who makes the style guide? Is it design leadership? Is it more junior designers? What about developers that don't do design? Junior
Sure. Honestly, I mean, I've had good success in my practice with actually working with a fairly diverse cross-section from an organization. So I would say, as many people that are going to be touching the actual patterns themselves as is practical to include in that exercise is really valuable, because even if you can't get everybody in the same room, at least having like somebody who can act as an evangelist for the pattern library who's involved in some of those decisions to go back to their teams is really valuable. So design leadership, senior developers, senior designers, because I mean, even if they're not actually going to be, let's say a developer is probably not going to be involved in visual layout for some of these patterns, they're still going to need to know the names of these things and why they're valuable, and so they can make intelligent decisions about how to actually incorporate them into their products. So, yeah, it's wide ranging. Thank you. I'll take maybe one more question, and then we can just sort of hang and chat. Hanging and chat.
I have a question.
Please, yeah.
How did you manage to have slides on some previous question?
Okay. You mean the
question before the last one.
Right. I skipped over those basically. Like I was like,
and it just happened to be about that exact question.
I may or may not have mentioned the gentleman's question, but yeah, this is like, thank you. Yes. Anyway, I like talking about this stuff. I don't get out much. I have so many slides. Anyway, thanks. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for coming. We're going to be hanging around here for a little while longer, eating the pizza and drinking the drinks. So feel free to stick around and chat with any of us.
What is the point of your slides?
Oh, and if anyone has announcements,
the one that looks like this.
That would be okay time, if you're hiring or looking to get hired. Line up here.
Does anyone have an announcement?
Yeah. If I see the writing, I will remember.
I can remember.
Hi, I'm Maria. I'm a bit of design and dockyard. And we are looking for an CSS subject developer. So if anyone is available, please talk to me. How much is it?
And do they have a WhatsApp anymore? Or we can kind of close down the mic for the night and chat. Alright. See you all next month.
Yeah.